think we're good to go. My name is Dan Hughes. As I mentioned before, I'm a faculty member in photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I'm also an avid film photographer still. I say still because it seems strange when I talk to some people about it. But I find there's a lot of uses for film, whether it's large format stuff or just kind of the pacing I get to shoot at when shooting with my X-Pan or any sort of 35mm camera. Long story short, today's webinar, it says Secrets of Creative Film Results in the Digital Darkroom using the NIC collection by DxO. I'm not sure if I could call these secrets necessarily, but they're thought processes and ways of doing things. And I want to talk to you about taking an image into the NIC plugins to emulate analog effects or analog styles. I want to talk about what those things could mean and what they are and how you can use them, whether or not you're even looking to get in, if you will, an analog or a film-esque effect or look. So the first thing that we should probably do is talk about a little primer of what photosensitive materials do, what they are, film basically. We could talk about this for hours and hours. I'd like to do that. We don't have time to do that. So I'm gonna throw this one out there. Are there any photographers in the audience right now, if you don't mind typing into the questions box, who did shoot film or who does shoot film now? Do you guys shoot film? I know that there's probably some folks out there who've never shot a roll of film in their entire life or a sheet of film, in which case, just to kind of talk about what we're going for here, analog effects, is we're emulating some of the things that would occur with photosensitive materials, that is light-sensitive materials like photographic film. And in basically speaking, whether it's black and white film or color film, there's a particular kind of silver, literally the metal silver, that is, let's see, how do I word this quickly? It's sensitive to light because of the makeup of the atoms in its system, right? And basically, when light strikes these pieces of silver, it reacts in some way. Black and white photography has a particular kind of emulsion, so the particular way of this silver being oriented. And then in color films, it's a much more complex system of layers, and those layers of silver actually are sensitive to different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So basically, they're sensitive to different parts of the color that we see, for the most part. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about how we can take our kind of digital, perfect, linear images and kind of throw that out the door for aesthetic purposes, to either control the image in an interesting way or to create the effect of maybe a favorite film type, or go beyond that and kind of create our own custom films. So looking at our comments, we've got a couple photographers who are shooting film. I like it. It's a different feel, it's a different process for sure, and a different cost at this point too. But it looks like a lot of folks here do and have shot film, not anymore. Shot film in the 60s through the 2000s, shot film into 2006. I think Albert, I think you're right on the nose there. That was when one of the massive changeovers happened around 2006 to 2008 from film to digital. Wow, a lot of folks still shooting black and white film. Very cool. Okay. And Keith just mentioned that I don't see anything. Right now, you should be able to see my DxO PhotoLab. I'm open in an image of, it's a windy day in a field. Keith, if you can't see that, I think the fastest way to reconnect is to log out of the webinar and log back in. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, if you have an audio or visual hiccup or problem, give the system 20 to 30 seconds. If it doesn't refresh, if it doesn't catch up, as we sort of click into these different things, log out of the webinar and log back in, and that should fix the problem. Okay, so we've talked very briefly about what's happening with film. it's photosensitive, it's light sensitive material. You put in a camera and you get different results depending upon the different film types. And you'd also get different capabilities depending upon the film types. And what's cool about this or interesting is that there's direct relationship, obviously, to digital photography. It's just instead of using an emulsion, a material that's coated on acetate or plastic, or whatever material your film is made out of, we are using our digital cameras to convert that light into a digital signal. And one of the beauties of a digital signal in 2019 with our beautiful digital cameras is that we have an exceedingly wide dynamic range. So the lightest lights in the darkest dark areas of our images, they render beautifully. But what that can mean is that you have a linear looking or a relatively flat looking image off the bat. And that's great for the purpose of post-processing, meaning we can do stuff with these beautiful raw files. But it's not so great because right out of camera, unless the lighting is brilliant and beautiful, which can't happen all of the time, we need to massage these tones and textures and things. And in fact, I think my grouping of images, I primarily have these sort of cloudy day images. These are very common in Rochester, New York. This is a shot from California, just looked like another world, like Mars or something like that. And then I've got, one sort of direct sunlight on a hazy day, and the rest are kind of these relatively flat looking contrast ranges. And I point that out because the film kinds of effects that we're working with today, you'll get a different effect depending upon your raw image, depending upon the lighting in your photograph, and so on and so forth. But I want to show you a couple tricks so that you can adjust the preset or the tool that we're using so that you can get a consistent look across different kinds of lighting situations. And then also just to give you kind of more control over your post-processing. So in this first kind of demo, I just want to open up the software. I'm going to open up Color Efex Pro, and I want to show you a couple filters in Color Efex Pro that will yield you analog looking film-like effects and controls as well. There are a whole bunch of black and white film emulations, which I hope to get to towards the end of the webinar, that are built into Silver Efex, but I actually have a whole series of webinars throughout this month that's talking about these different kinds of film aspects. So there's only a certain amount of stuff that we can cover in these 45 minutes. So definitely come back to these other webinars if you have the opportunity, or check them out on YouTube after they've gone live. So let's click on the Nick collection. By the way, I'm in PhotoLab 3, which is the next version from PhotoLab 2. And if you don't already have the Nick collection and you purchase the Nick collection, it actually comes with basically this piece of software, the previous version of the software. There are some cool new things in PhotoLab 3, but we'll get into that too sometime. So down in the lower right corner of the interface, I'm going to click on the Nick collection. As that launches, I'm going to click onto Color Efex Pro 4 and just mention that I am launching the plugin from PhotoLab, and we are going to be taking an image or two over into Photoshop and launching the plugins from Photoshop as well during this webinar. So it doesn't matter whether you use Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom, or Adobe Photoshop, or PhotoLab 3, all of the techniques and things that we're learning about today will be the same, no matter which of the host pieces of software that we're working with. For people who might not be familiar, if you're brand new to the Nick collection, we are within Color Efex Pro 4 right now, which is a collection of 55 individual filters, which will yield thousands of different effects. And it's almost overwhelming. We're only going to cover like 4 filters today. The software is opened up into the foliage filter, and what this filter does is it looks for any foliage, stuff that's yellow and green primarily, and it allows you to control its color in a certain way to kind of emphasize those colors. I'm not going to use that filter today, so I'm going to go ahead and close it. I'm going to click the X on the right side of that filter, and that's going to close that filter. and we're going to move over to the left side of the interface, and I'm going to click on the Film Efex Modern filter. This is a filter that is sort of underserved in the grouping of filters, and it is one of 4 of the different film effects filters. So the Film Efex Modern filter emulates 20-something of the most popular color film types. So these are contemporary, although a lot of them aren't produced anymore by Kodak or Fuji, but these are sort of contemporary film effects. And what you can do with them is basically just scroll over each one and you're going to yield a different result. And what this filter is doing is it's emulating or attempting to emulate what this photograph would have looked like had it been shot with that particular film type. So as I scroll over each one, right now I'm the Fujichrome Astia 100F, this is what that picture would have looked like. In fact, just to give the image a little bit more real estate on screen, I'm going to hide the filter library on the left. It's going to give us just a larger image here. And then we're going to scroll over this. We'll go back down to the Astia. Here's a Pro Via. And basically, you can see exactly what you're going to get with the particular film type. And each of these film types is unique to this. Sorry, each of these, as I can't speak, each of these film emulations here is going to be basically a unique representation of what this picture would have looked like. So the Fujichrome Sensia 100 compared to the Fujichrome Sensia 200. So not a dramatic difference, but there's a difference in the curve and a little difference in the color response. Now, what I want to do in this case is just find an emulation that I like. I think I was playing around with this yesterday. I really like this Kodak Max 400. So I'm going to click on it. And then I'm presented with 2 sliders for now, the brightness slider and the contrast slider. This image is a relatively flat photo because of the way that it was shot on the day that it was shot. And if I wanted to increase contrast, I can do that very easily with this contrast slider. From there, I can move into the film details. I'm going to actually skip that for this image because it opens up into a whole different can of worms. And we're just going to quickly cover this shadows slider and the highlights slider. The shadows slider is going to attempt to retain shadow detail as I slide this slider to the right. And so what the goal is if this filter with the Kodak Max film type was maybe losing detail in the dark shadows, like if I increase this contrast slider, I can actually save my shadow detail by taking this shadow slider to the right. So in this way, I'm able to increase the contrast dramatically if that's what I want, but I can also save my shadow detail. A lot of the filters built into Color Efex Pro 4 have these 2 sliders, the shadow protection slider and the highlight protection slider. I don't think I need the highlight protection slider in this case, but one aesthetic choice you could make is to actually increase this highlight slider. As I do that, your screen isn't getting darker. What's happening is the highlights, the brighter values in the image are being muted. So if I actually scroll down to the bottom portion of our interface here, where we have a loop in a histogram, you can see what's happening to the image visually in the preview here on the left, but you can also see what's happening in the histogram as you adjust your highlight slider. What's happening is the software is taking those brightest values and it's pushing them to the left in the histogram to try and retain that detail. If I take it all the way up, you can see it's smooshing, it's actually tone mapping this image by smooshing those highlights towards the left of the histogram itself. So this might be a handy tool. In this case, it actually does work nicely so that I can increase the contrast, but yet still retain all of my good shadow and highlight detail. So that's that. This is just using the Film Efex Modern filter. And if we take a look at the before and after, here's the original image and here's the after. That's sort of like the entry point to creating a kind of film-esque effect on our images with Color Efex Pro 4. To take it one step further, I'm going to go ahead and show our filter list. I'm going to move over to the right side of the interface where I'm going to click the Add Filter button, where basically what's going to happen as I click the Add Filter button is it closes up the Film Efex Modern and leaves us some space for our filter. So now I can move over to something like the image border filter or any of the filters on the left side of the interface, and we can start stacking our filters together to create a look or a recipe. I'm going to click on image borders. I like the combination of the Film Efex filters with this image border filter because in the darkroom, one of the things that you could do is if you took your enlarger film holder, so the thing that you'd actually put the film, mount the film in before making an enlargement or print, you can take a file to that and you could actually file out the edge. And what you'd get as a result is the edge of the film actually showing up in your print, in the resulting image. And so this is really a nice way of creating a kind of finished effect. And this image border filter, I think, combines nicely with the Film Efex filters. Each of these different filters is going to have a whole series of different types or tools within them. This image border filter has 14 different types of borders, from type 14, which is just a white border around the edge. Type 13 is a black border around the edge. And then the rest of them kind of imitate or emulate a kind of film-esque edge. And another interesting point about it, let's say I click on type number 8, I encroach into the image a little bit. Let's say we like this, but I want to vary it. I want it to change. I can click the Vary Border button here in the filter, and that's going to basically keep the same style of the image border, but it's going to change the effect in the details of the filter itself. So it's basically like rotating and moving that bordered effect. And then beyond that, we can change the size, which is how far into the image the filter encroaches, the spread, which is the thickness of the stroke, and then the edge roughness or hardness. If I set it to clean, the edge is going to be soft and clean. If you set it over towards rough, you're going to get this nice rough edge showing up. In fact, I'm going to hit Command plus to zoom in a couple times just to sort of bring that home. Right now, the rough slider is, or the hardness slider is set to rough. If I jump over to clean, you can see how your effect changes. So it's a nice way of varying that border, and it gives you this really beautiful finished aesthetic that, in my mind, emulates some of the things that you could actually do in the darkroom. So let's say we love what we've got, and we want to save this combination, our film effects and our image border, so that we can use this another time on another image or another grouping of images. To save this as a recipe, you move to the right side underneath the filter stack and you click the Save Recipe button. When you do this, it just asks you to name the recipe. So I'm going to actually click Cancel because I want a little bit of information. We use the Kodak Max 400 film and then the image border. So I'm going to go ahead and just name this Custom Kodak 400 Max. And I'm going to say with edge. So I've named my recipe. I click the OK button once I've named the recipe, and then my custom recipes. So any of the recipes that I've created myself are going to show up here on the custom recipes section. So the custom Kodak 400 with edge filter recipe. And basically what's going to happen is the next time I open the software, I'll be able to click on this custom Kodak 400 Max with edge recipe, and it will load these filters with this exact effect. And so this is great for consistency purposes, keeping consistent looks and feels, for speeding along my workflow, because I only want to do the work once, even though I'm going to be able to, keep making this same effect happen over and over again. And the other beauty of it, in my mind, is it shows me some potential. By creating my own custom recipes, I can sort of rummage through my previous recipes on different images, and I can decide, well, what aesthetic do I actually want with the image? And by saving a bunch of these recipes, I'm going to see that. I'm going to be able to get it. So now that we've finished with our recipe, I'm going to go ahead and click the Save button in the lower right corner of the interface. That's going to basically bring us back into our host software, which in this case is PhotoLab 3. And what we're going to get in PhotoLab 3, or if you're using Lightroom, same thing's going to happen. You're going to have your original image in your grouping here, and then you're going to have your enhanced image show up right next to it. So if we look at the before and after, there's the original raw file, beautiful photograph, but sort of flat and linear. And then here, using our film type recipe, we're able to create a nice effect and style. Now, the thing about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that's just the beginning, right? That's just starting out. So from here, let's jump into this picture of Ellie, and let's talk about how we can set up the raw file for some success. Actually, before I do that, let me take a look at the GoToWebinar control panel. I just want to make sure that we're good to go. Michael just asked, is there a Hasselblad border look? Michael, not in the image borders filter, not in Color Efex or Analog Efex Pro. If you wanted the rebate of a Hasselblad, you either have to make your own. And actually, I think there's an Edge software that does give you the rebate of a Hasselblad. The thing about that is I don't know if they'd actually name it that, because Hasselblad might not be happy with potential copyright infringements. And then the other thing is with these frames, the image borders that we have in Color Efex, because you can vary them and change them, there's no sort of consistent V like what you'd get from the two Vs of a Hasselblad, at least the V series Hasselblads. So, oh, sorry. I couldn't quite hear. Siri thinks I was talking to her. Okay, so no problem, Michael, good question. So, all right, looks like everybody's good to go. Let's jump back into PhotoLab 3. I'm gonna minimize my control panel here. Here we've got this picture of Ellie. We're gonna create a film effect on it. But before we do that, let's talk about setting the image up. So right now I've got my histogram, which is closed. And in this case, in my histogram, I've got good shadow detail, some areas that are totally black back here. You can see that in the histogram. And then some areas that are almost white, almost blown out. So one thing that I'm gonna do, because I know when I start applying some of these analog effects, the initial contrast range from the filter is going to be pretty high typically. It adds contrast in most of those film effects because there's a curve that's associated with each of those effects within the filter. We can change those things in Color Efex, but I found I get better results if I massage the tones a little bit in the raw processing. So in this case, I know that this area in the foreground is going to become distractingly bright if I add contrast to it. It's just going to blow out. And then her eyes, Ellie's eyes, are pretty dark. You can see there's good detail in them, although I think I misfocused a little bit, maybe not. Anyways, there's a little bit of texture, but what I want to do is use a control point and just bring out a little extra detail here while we're in the raw processing, because there's so much more information in a raw file than there is when having to deal with like a TIFF or even a JPEG, especially a JPEG, I should say. So I tend to set up my files the way I think they need to be ahead of time, and that's going to yield us a better result for the most part. And in this case, all I'm going to do is use some local adjustments. So here in PhotoLab, I can click the local adjustments button in the top, and then I actually have control points, which we haven't talked about control points, but these are one of the main tools within the Color Efex Pro, within the whole NIC collection, but within Color Efex Pro specifically as well. Here in PhotoLab, I've clicked on local adjustments. I've got my, by default, I think this also happens, but I've got my control point sort of crosshair here ready to go. If for some reason I didn't, I can right click on the image, and here in PhotoLab, these are different selective editing tools, from a brush to a gradient filter to our control points, and then even an auto mask, which is an edge detection brush, which actually might work well here, but I'm gonna use a control point. So I'm gonna click on control points. I'm gonna just click and drop the control point on the object that I want to adjust. And then I've got a couple things that are going on here, and I'm going to sort of explain this and talk about it here within PhotoLab. This is working exactly the same way within the Nick collection. I just have different controls here within PhotoLab. So the first thing I want to do is adjust the area here, the area of influence, which is this circle that's surrounding the control point. And basically what this point does is it looks for the object that I've placed the point on. So I placed the point on the comforter here, that's on this actually blow-up mattress, and what's happening is it's looking for that object inside of this area. And it happens to be a circle, but this area is called the area of influence. And if I take one of these adjustment sliders like the exposure, what's happening is the software is looking to basically just adjust the similar tones, colors, and textures. So I can go and brighten that way up, right? And here I'm blowing out that foreground, or I can sort of darken it down, maybe by a half a stop or so, add a little bit of contrast, and then add a little bit of micro contrast. So built into each of these control points, you have all of these different kinds of luminosity adjustments. I have all of these different color adjustments, and I have a couple different sharpening or detail adjustments that are built into the control points in PhotoLab. When we jump back into Color Efex, we'll have plus and minus control points, and I'll explain those as we go. Long story short, I'm setting up the raw file for success when we move into Color Efex. And I've gone and darkened down these tones, but I want to show you two things. First thing is if I take this area of influence and I expand this all the way around the foreground, or around the entire image rather, the software is going to think that we want to take any tone, color, and texture that's inside of this area, and we want to adjust those tones, colors, and textures that match, right? Watch what happens. In fact, I'm going to take my exposure way down. You can see it does a pretty good job just adjusting the this comforter in the foreground. It's also actually affecting the whites of her eyes. Watch the whites of her eyes. See how it goes really dark in some of the highlights in her skin? So I want to be very careful of that. And I actually don't want this area to be this big. We're going to make it really small. But before we do that, watch what happens if I take this control point and I drag it over to the pink of her jacket. So basically, the control point is making a live and instant selection. Place it in the background, you can see what it's doing, and as I move it around. And what it wants to do is select whatever object we've placed it on. And it's basically as simple as that. It takes some getting used to. If you've never used these control points before, whether it's within the Nick plugins or if it's here within PhotoLab, but once you get used to them and you get used to thinking about making selections and selective adjustments with them, it opens up a whole new world of photographic capability. Basically, because I don't have to do much if any work, and I get a very photographic looking selection as I place the point on the object. And in this case, I've burned the exposure. I've darkened the exposure down by about a stop. And I know I'm kind of dwelling here in PhotoLab and I want to open up into Color Efex, but because the processing of the raw file is such an important thing, and we're here in PhotoLab, I want to make sure we hit upon these things and cover them a bit. So now I've taken a small control point and I've placed it in her eye. I'm going to take the exposure up. I want to be careful. If I take it too high, it's going to look really funky and really strange. So I want to just dodge her eye, maybe half a stop. I can add a little contrast, a little micro contrast, and then move into the color tools. So each of these control points broken up into light, color, and then detail. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and take the vibrancy up a little bit for her eyes, just a touch, not too far. If we wanted to, we could actually do custom color balances based upon each of these control points. So if I wanted her eyes to actually be a little bit cooler and blue, I could maybe take the temperature down, or if I wanted them to be a little bit warmer, a little more orange, we could totally do that as well. I need to be careful as to what I do here because I want to keep a relatively natural color, but you can easily change the color and tone. You could even adjust the hue if you wanted to in each of these control points. Now, I've made the adjustment to the eye. I want the exact same adjustment to happen in this eye. And so all I have to do is actually click and drop a new point in her eye here. And what's going to happen is these two control points are exact duplicates of each other. So if I make an adjustment within the contrast, it's going to affect both of these points. So it's just an interesting little difference between this piece of software and then the Nik collection, which works a little bit differently. But anyways, I've massaged those tones. I'm going to zoom back out. I need to make one more mask, and I'm going to darken down the upper left corner of this image to kind of match the density of the upper right corner a little bit better. But I'm going to click the new mask button in the lower right. I'm going to place a point in the upper left corner of the image, and then I'm just going to I'm just going to burn this upper left corner a little bit, darken it down. Not much, half a stop or so. But again, now what I'm getting out of this as I click the close button is a image that's closer to the kind of light and color that I know I want. And then I'm going to put the kind of film aesthetic or look using the Nik collection. So let's go and do that. We're going to click into the Nik collection here and go into Color Efex Pro 4. We're going to use the Film Effects Modern filter again, but let's go ahead and click through the different film effects filters and just kind of talk about the differences between each one. As this opens, the Film Effects Modern filter emulates 20-something different, 20-something different contemporary film types. The Film Effects Faded, so follow me on the left side of the screen here. The Film Effects Faded, the Film Effects Nostalgic, and the Film Effects Vintage all attempt to yield an analog-esque, a faded-esque kind of filtering of the image. And there are customizable adjustments in there, but they do yield you different results. Here's the Film Effects Vintage basic preset, Film Effects Nostalgic, and Film Effects Faded. Now, the initial image is just that. It's just an initial application of the filter. There's a million billion different things that you could do with all of these filters. It's just a matter of going through the tool set on the right and controlling them, and or using this other really neat feature, and that is if you're scrolled over one of the filters on the left side, and you'll see this little stack of what looks like prints over here. If you click on that little stack of prints that's to the right of the filter, you get different film effects faded or different filter specific kinds of presets. So here's the bright blue. This is magenta with dye migration. Here's toy camera, 70s toy camera. Here's soft purple, right? So this is the same filter, Film Effects Faded. It's just this is a series of kind of presets that are built into this particular film type or filter. Every single filter in the Color Efex Pro menagerie, if you will, has these kinds of effects, has these kinds of presets. So what I've gone and done is clicked on Film Effects Vintage. If I click on the little stack, here we've got something like 10 different or 7 different presets that are just for this one filter. And so what's cool about this is it gives you a potential look and feel. Now, you might say, oh, you know, why on earth would I ever want my image to look this way? First of all, I don't know, maybe aesthetically, this is something you're interested in creating. But also, if you are, you know, a designer, or if you're in marketing, there's definitely applications for these kinds of effects. If you're an artist, of course, you can do anything you want to the image. But if you are sort of in the commercial arts or realm of things, this is a great way of creating a kind of vintage-esque effect very quickly and easily. And then if you want the control, you can move over into the tools palette on the right side and control whatever you want. Here we can go and desaturate the image. We could warm or cool the photograph, and then maybe take the brightness down a little. And let's actually add a bunch of grain by taking the film grain per pixel slider to the left, and then we can increase or decrease the film strength as well, right? And so beyond that, and I need to be careful here, because beyond that, the other thing that you can do is add and remove the film effects or whatever filter you're using control points. So here I can go and take a minus control point and take the effect right off of her face or her eyes, right? And it's going to look funky right now because I've added so much grain on this image, but I can take that minus control point, I can place it here in her eyes, maybe place another minus control point on her skin, and then if I wanted to, I can actually control the opacity of this effect with the control point as well. In fact, let's delete these control points. Let me explain that one more time. So right now, the film effects filter is being applied to the entire photograph. If I didn't want the film effects filter applied to a particular part of the photograph, I could take minus control points and I could go ahead and just place the point on the area or object where I don't want the effect. So let's say on her skin and her eyes. So I'm going to take small minus control points, place them there. I'm going to also just take a larger minus control point and place it on her skin tone. And now we're removing this filter effect. And now there's this weird hybrid kind of filtering effect because we've got the film effects with this funky grain and colorization on most of the image, but not on her face. And you say, okay, that's crazy. Why on earth would you do that? Well, the next step is to click the Add Filter button. And then let's go ahead and just add the, how about instead of the film effects vintage, we can add film effects nostalgic. And then I'm going to choose a film type. And I'm just throwing a concept out here. The filter combination that we're using is not that important. But what we're going to do here is I'm going to add a different film effect only to her face and eyes, right? In fact, it might look a little bit strange. So the first filter is the film effects vintage, and the second one is film effects nostalgic. Again, you could use this on any combination using any of the different film types or any of the different filters themselves, not just these two film type filters. And so what we're seeing now, because I'm using plus control points on her face with this one filter, and we're using minus control points from the film effects vintage, is we're using these two different filters to get a different effect on the same image. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and just reduce some of the opacity on her skin just a little bit. If we look at the before and after, now we have, we've got the original linear image of Ellie, and then now we have our film effects vintage and film effects nostalgic combined together to create this kind of interesting effect. And the beauty of this is that the results from mixing these different filters are absolutely endless. So you can create your own combination of filters and then using control points, decide where you want each of those different filters to be applied. Now, that's a good one. It's a wonderful trick and it's a wonderful way of using the different filters in your filter stack. And I love the combination of these different film effects filters. But I need to go more in depth into the film effects modern filter. And so let's do that starting with this image, and then we'll take a look at maybe two more pictures where we're sort of really dialing in exactly what's happening. So I've clicked on the film effects modern filter. I've deleted the other two filters. We're going to use this Fuji Chrome Provia 100F. It's a beautiful chrome film, 100 speed chrome film, great for commercial work. Lots of folks still use this film, although I don't know if it's still being produced by Fuji. People still are shooting it. So we're presented with our two sliders that we've already covered within Film Effects Modern, brightness and contrast. But if I click onto film details, a whole world opens up to us. And this is where we can adjust the color sensitivity, which is basically the brightness, the density level of each of these colors, and then our saturation level of each of the colors, along with a tone curve, a grain adjustment, and then of course, control points down at the very bottom. And so we could do an entire webinar where we're just talking about these different sliders and adjustments. But as a once over, your color sensitivity is basically how each color renders. So if I take my red color sensitivity slider and I slide it to the left, it darkens down anything that's red, or anything that the software sees as rendering with some red and red pixels. So basically, you can adjust the tone of your red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and violet, and so on. In fact, if I take my blue slider to the left, you'll notice this little block that's in the foreground next to her hand is being adjusted dramatically, right? And you can control all aspects of these things. So you can create your own custom, and or you can massage the tones as you see fit. Like her skin tone is a little bit brighter than I want it to be. We can of course take care of that 50 different ways, but I think the easiest way to do that here is to take this yellow slider and just drag it to the left a little bit. If I take it too far, it's going to make her skin dark and ruddy. Might be great for Halloween, not so helpful in this case for this portrait. So I'll take that yellow slider down a little bit. If we wanted to control the saturation levels of different colors, like let's say I wanted my yellows to have more saturation, I'll increase the yellow slider. Maybe my blue is too saturated, the color is too vivid. I can take my blue slider and I can darken that down. I can remove some of the saturation of the blue. And then if we scroll into the tone curve, this tone curve is the tonal response of this particular film type. In fact, it doesn't look like there's any tone curve of red, green, and blue, but you can click on this drop-down menu and you can shift and change the color representation of the tone curve itself. So you can, again, create your own custom film types. If I were to go into this tone curve and just double click on the little dots there, the little placeholders, this is going to home those that curve. So now it's a linear curve. And I can go in and just click and drop points wherever I want them to be. So I click and drop a point, and I can make a really complex curve. I can make a super simple curve depending upon what we're doing. And if I wanted to create a kind of a vintage style of this particular film type, I can do something like this, because the very upper right dot placeholder here is your highlights. I can go and fade those highlights down, right? By just clicking on it and dragging it downward, it's indicating that we want those values to be darker, and you can see what's happening in the histogram. So at its default setting, the highlights are basically hugged right up against the right of the histogram. If I start dragging this downward, I'm sort of muting those tones, and I'm affecting the entire curve, right? So you're seeing that whole curve move with us. So we can kind of adjust from there as we see fit. So now we have sort of like this Pro-Via, but it's like a faded Pro-Via effect. In fact, I'm going to click into the upper left corner. We click on a split preview. It's a relatively subtle adjustment, but here's the before. There's the after. And it's just enough. It's just this nice little simple tweak that's going to yield us this effect of that Pro-Via film, in this case muted as well. And then because this is a 100 speed film, our grain per pixel is at about 455. If we wanted to increase the grain, we could go ahead and drag that grain per pixel. This works exactly the same way within Silver Efex Pro as well. So it's the same grain emulation, and that's going to change based upon your contrast as well. So it's a really powerful tool and a really beautiful way of adding some grain to the image. So let's say we love this effect. We've got our Pro-Via effect. I'm going to click the Save button in the lower right corner. That's going to bring us back over into our host piece of software. And for the remainder of the webinar, I'm going to open two images up into Photoshop, and we can sort of finish out. So as my Photoshop launches, I'm going to take this image, and we'll come back and take another photo. I'm going to export it to an application. So in the lower right corner, click Export to Application. I want to open it into Photoshop. All of my settings look good, so I'm going to click Export. As that happens, so basically what's going to happen is this raw file is going to be duplicated as a TIFF file, and then Photoshop is going to launch, and then in Photoshop we're going to have access to the Nik plugins. As that launches, I'm just going to take a quick look at our questions. Will the webinar be recorded? Yes, Paul, this webinar, all of the webinars that we put on for DxO Nik software are recorded, and they will be posted both on the recorded webinars section of the Nik software website, as well as on YouTube on the Nick Software official page. In fact, I have something like 20 webinars that are currently posted, and then historic stuff as well from like 2013 and previous to that, which you can find on there. In the PhotoLab, how do you adjust the circle size? You know how to do it in the plugins. I'll show you, Michael. I'm going to save that question to the end, though, so we'll save that Q&A for the Q&A portion. Okay, so minimize, go to Webinar Control Panel. We're here in Photoshop, and I want to show in Photoshop because in Lightroom and in PhotoLab, the software kind of responds the same way. Your original raw file is duplicated, and you end up with 2 images, so that we're working in a non-destructive fashion while in PhotoLab or Lightroom. Here in Photoshop is also non-destructive process, but we're working with layers, and therefore we have another thing, layer masks, that we can work with, which is a really wonderful tool. Now, we're gonna open directly into Color Efex Pro 4. I basically wanna show you this workflow one more time, but what it looks like from Photoshop. I didn't do anything to this raw file aside from whatever PhotoLab did, which was an optical correction and then a noise reduction and sharpening effect. That was what was done to the original image. So the other thing that I want to do here, if we find a preset that we really like let's say we like this Ektachrome 400, but it's not exactly what we want. Like the reds and the yellows are a little bit brighter than what I want. I'm going to click on my preset. I'm going to move into my film details, and then I'm going to go into my saturation and say, okay, well, my reds are too bright, so I actually need to go to the sensitivity. So I'm going to dial that down a little bit, and then my yellows are a little bit too bright as well. So I'm going to darken that down. And then I may say, okay, well, my reds are a little bit too saturated, so I'm going to take the saturation down. If I remove all red saturation, basically, the building here is primarily red, so it's removing all of that color, and it's going basically neutral. Looks like it's almost cyan. So you can control the exact amount of color here as you might want, and increase it or decrease it as you see fit. And that is a mighty orange building there as I bring my saturation all the way up. So just like kind of a minute ago, I showed you how to combine those 2 filters together. Let's say we actually wanted to do that again in a slightly different way. So let's say we like this color and tonal response on everything except the sky. What we can do is combine this filter with another filter. So I can click the Add Filter button, and then I can move into, I could use the same filter over again as we sort of adjusted with the film types. Sorry, let me find that again. Film effects. So we were just using Film Effects Modern. I could use a different film effect, but instead of that, in this case, I say we use the low key filter and we darken down the density of the sky. So by default, the low key filter wants to darken, wants to sort of burn the whole image down to create a low key sort of photograph. And that's wonderful and lovely, but I don't need that to happen on most of the image. I kind of just want the density in the sky. So what I'm going to do is adjust my settings: glow, standard, dynamic, low key. Saturation I'm okay with. Whites, let's increase the whites. So it's going to basically take the value of those clouds and brighten them up. But we only want the effect on the sky. So what we'll do is take the plus control point button and just place plus control points in the areas where we want the effect. And we'll make sure to put minus control points in the areas where we don't want the effects. So in this case, we can probably get away with a couple larger control points because the blue of the sky is its kind of own color and tone, as opposed to some other images where you need to use a lot of smaller control points to really get a honed in selection. In fact, let's see what this tool is doing. You can see the before and after as I click the checkbox next to the filter, the low key filter. But if I move into the control points list, by the way, every single filter in the Color Efex Pro 4 software has this option here. So if you follow me to the right side and I click on the word control points, this is a control point list. As you add more and more control points, they will be listed out. If you ever want to see where your control points are affecting and where they are not, you can control each control point individually. So by clicking the checkbox that's to the right of each control point, you're able to see what this control point is affecting and what it is not. Or if you click on the box that has the little circle in it, you'll actually see where the effect is being applied overall and where it is not. Anything that is white has this low key filter, has this particular filter applied to it. Anything that is black has none of the effect to it. So like this area in the image has none of the effect, but a lot of this image is being affected by low key, and maybe we don't want it to be. So what we'll do while we're in this mode is take a minus control point, and we'll just start dropping minus control points into the areas where we don't want the effect to be applied. So I'm going to place it in here, size my area of influence. I actually kind of only use this mode where we're viewing the selection to get started. Once I've started kind of this process of honing in the selection, I'll actually turn this effect, the masking effect, off and pay more attention to what's happening on the image than pay attention to what's happening in that mask. And the reason I want to do that is because the control points are going to make very photographic looking selections. And therefore, sometimes I actually do want some of this low key filter or some of the filter that we're applying to be affecting some of these other areas so that we get a photographic looking effect as opposed to just cutting something out, right? So one of the things that you can do within Photoshop is use all sorts of different selection tools, some of which basically just cut stuff out, like a lasso tool or a pen tool or the beginning of a quick select tool. And that can be a wonderful way of working in certain situations, but in other situations, I actually do want a little bit of that sort of residual low key actually affecting some areas, right? It kind of makes sense that maybe some of this low key filter is affecting maybe portions of the actual building itself. And if we don't want that to happen, we just keep taking those minus control points, placing it on the areas where we don't want the effect to be. But in this way, now we have our Film Effects Modern and we have a low key filter controlled to the utmost degree with these control points, and we're controlling and commanding the viewer's attention through the image while aesthetically adjusting the effect to have this kind of analog effect and style. If I press and hold the compare button in the upper left corner, you see the original raw file as we opened it, and then we see the enhanced image using the Film Effects Modern and then the low key filter for the sky. When we're finished with the image and the effect, in this case, we just click the OK button in the lower right corner of the interface, and that's going to bring us back over into our host piece of software, back into Photoshop in this case. And in Photoshop, we will have our original layer of pixels, and then duplicated, we'll have the original layer of pixels, and then those layers, or that layer, will be duplicated to a separate layer where we'll have the application of the Nik plugin applied to a separate layer of pixels so that we can do as we want to do with those pixels. So again, quick before and after. Here's the before, and then here's the after effect. From here, I might move into Analog Efex Pro and just aesthetically adjust this from here to maybe take it another step further. In fact, I'm going to open this. As that launches, I'm going to take a look at our GoToWebinar control panel. We're going to move into a Q&A in just a minute or two, so if there are any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. If not, I'm just going to keep talking here. So we have focused primarily on using the Film Effects Modern filter from Color Efex for this webinar. But there's a whole slew of different ways of getting these kinds of throwback looks, if you will. One way is to use Analog Efex Pro 2. So this software is specifically designed to create these kinds of analog maladies or problems or aesthetic choices, if we want to call them that. And the software is broken up into cameras. So in the upper left corner, right now we're on the classic camera and it has its own series of presets here. But if I wanted to change up the look and the feel, I click on the word classic camera in the upper left corner. And then I have these 11 different choices, and then also a camera kit. The camera kit allows you to make your own combination of these different filters. Really powerful tool. The 11 tool combinations are exactly that. They are combinations of these different tools. And in fact, the En Vogue presets that are here, I developed these for Nik Software back in December, and they launched, I want to say, in March or so. And in fact, the film emulations that you see in Silver Efex Pro 2, there are 10 brand new film emulations, sort of one of the points of this series of webinars that we're doing. I developed those just a couple of months ago to emulate these different kinds of film types. So the beauty of that, I guess, is what I'm getting at is Nik Software, DxO, is continuing to move forward and adding new things into these plugins, which I'm very excited about, because for a while here, there wasn't much, if any, movement on the Nik plugins. And so now we've got this wonderful commitment from DxO to continue forward and to be developing the software and the plugins. What I'm clicking on right now are just these different En Vogue recipes, or sort of camera adjustments. This is called Good Vibrations, so you can see a doubling of the details. It's kind of a fun one, and definitely creates this interesting aesthetic where you've got a double exposure effect and this nice blurring effect. And of course, you can control all of the different attributes of these tools by moving over to the right side of the interface here. Here's double exposure streaked number 4. And I'm going to leave it at that. And we'll go ahead and transition into our Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box there. If not, we'll go ahead and hit the road. I didn't get to talk about everything I wanted to talk about today, but that's kind of what happens when we only have an hour. But hopefully you found this demonstration to be beneficial. I do have a question or two about control points, so I'll transition into that, but I'm just going to take a look. Has the Nik software been updated to work on the latest OS? Yes, so Don, I think I'm one version behind on this Mac, but the whole collection should be working in a stable fashion, even on the most contemporary operating system, Apple operating system, as well as Windows, as far as I know. So it should be working without a problem, Don. All right, so I'm going to click OK. The question that came in was pertaining to using control points here within PhotoLab 3. So let's jump into this picture. And let's say we want to make an adjustment to this picture selectively. Let's say we wanted to maybe bring out some of the texture of the dust that's sort of flying through the air here. I'm going to click on local adjustments. The default is control point, so I can just click and drop the control point. And the question was, how do you change the size of the area of influence that the control point is going to be affecting? And all you have to do is scroll over the edge of the area, and your cursor goes from being a little crosshair into these little arrows, and you literally just click and drag the size of your area of influence. So it's a little bit different than in the Nik collection where there's an actual slider. Here you have to click on the side of the control point itself and actually adjust that as you go. So I'm going to increase the micro contrast and a little bit of Clearview Plus, and then it actually kind of starts to disappear. Oop, don't want to blur it. Yeah, another interesting facet of the control points here within PhotoLab is that there's a blur feature. So like here in the foreground, my foreground in the corner is a little bit out of focus. I can go and throw it even further out of focus using the blur. We can go way out of focus and it's going to look real funky, but you do have that kind of control. And I'll just do that same thing in the corner here. That'll duplicate that blur, maybe even just sort of put a smattering of that blurred effect in the foreground. The problem that I'm going to run into is now I need to remove the effect from some of these different areas, like underneath his feet, because his shoes are sharp in the image and I want to retain that sharpness. Anyways, that answers that one. Very good. Another question. Is there any way to save a file with control points in progress? I'm thinking about being able to click and adjust control points the same way I can go back. So Michael, these control points on images within PhotoLab, you can absolutely do that. Like if we go back to this picture of Ellie, we did use some control points and they're all here and you can go in and readjust them as you see fit. If you're within the Nik collection themselves, like not in PhotoLab, but in one of the Nik plugins like Color Efex, the only way to save the positioning and adjustment of the control points is to launch from Photoshop and use this software as a smart object or a smart filter. So very quickly, I can show you that. If we jump back over into Photoshop, and let's say we turn the file into a smart object. There's a number of ways of doing this, Michael. So if you're not familiar with smart objects, watch a short YouTube video. I don't know which one to recommend right now, but basically there's a few different reasons and a few different ways of converting files into smart objects. In this case, I'm going to highlight these 3 layers. I'm going to right click on them, and then I'm going to say convert to smart object. And the idea here is that, excuse me, I will be able to re-edit the image. I will be able to basically go in and adjust control points as we want to, save them and adjust them as we see fit. This is going to take a second. Hopefully it doesn't boot us off of our webinar, as this sort of thing has happened before. And it's taking forever. This is a big file now. I think I've got, it's a 42 megapixel file, 45 megapixel file, and then I've got 3 layers of it, so it took it a minute. But let's say we go into Silver Efex Pro. As I do this, Silver Efex is not currently available. That's funky. Let's see. Oh, I wasn't clicked on my layer, that's why. So click on Silver Efex. It should just warn us saying that this is a smart object. It didn't even do that. And then in this case, since I've got you here, yep, it's warning us saying that this is a smart object, just to confirm that we know that. I'm going to move into our film types. Let's click on one of the new film types. These are brand new film types that are built into Silver Efex. Let's say we like this Fuji Neopan, and then I start dropping control points. Let's place a point up here, and I'm just going to kind of make some adjustments somewhat willy-nilly. Let's add some structure and contrast into the center. And then let's black out this shadow here in the foreground. Okay, so let's say we're happy with this result right now. We click the OK button. This is working with smart objects. And basically all of these adjustments are going to get saved into that smart object that we created as what's called a smart filter. And so the beauty of this is that now within my layers palette, I can just scroll over the Nik plugin that I've used, double click on it, it will open back up into that Nik plugin, and anything that we've done to the image will still be here on the photograph. So the film preset that we clicked on and then the control points that we clicked on are still here and are malleable. You just have to, if you're going to use a smart object workflow like this, you just have to remember to save as a PSD file or a layered TIFF file. Either one's going to work. And you need to retain the smart object kind of capability. But we can go and grab, drop the control points, add some contrast into this area, click that OK button again, and then that's going to go and reapply the Nik plugin, and then we can go back as many times or as few times as we might want to, as long as we save it in that smart object workflow. No problem, Michael. Great question. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I've kind of overstayed my welcome by about 10 minutes. I greatly appreciate everybody coming out to the webinar. Hopefully you found this to be a beneficial demonstration. I'm always down for feedback, so feel free to reach out, and I'd love to hear from you. And then also come on back to any and all of these webinars whenever you get the opportunity. I'd love to see you again soon. Thanks again for Nik Software at DxO. My name's Dan Hughes. Have a wonderful day.